My fellow warriors of liberty, in just a few short hours you will embark upon a great crusade for which we have striven tirelessly. I call upon you to approach your duties with the utmost diligence and dedication that I know you possess. The hopes and prayers of our Federation and all freedom-loving people in this quadrant accompany you on this journey. When you enter the battlefield, be fierce and be resolute, leaving no doubt that you are the nemesis of our enemy. But in the same breath, let us remember that if we are fierce in battle, we must also be magnanimous in victory. Our mission in Cardassia is not to conquer, but to liberate. Remember, our Cardassian counterparts did not ask for this war. Let us not cause them needless suffering. Treat them with the same respect and dignity we afford anyone else. Fight with valor and honor, and victory, along with peace, will swiftly follow. When the time comes for you to depart Cardassia, know that you have left it in a better state than before. Godspeed to each and every one of you. May you carry out your mission with courage and integrity, knowing that you serve a greater purpose in the pursuit of liberty and justice.
While history remembers the first and second battles of Chintoka as key turning points in the Dominion War, in reality, this is a misnomer. There is, in fact, only one Battle of Chintoka, a battle which raged from January to October of 2375. It is in the near 8 months of continuous fighting that we see the true significance and cost of this brutal campaign. Home to a single G-type star orbited by 5 planets, and more significantly over 50 smaller planetoids, Chintoka 2 and 3 are the 2 inhabited planets, while to most species the scorched desert surface of Chintoka 2 would be uninhabitable. For the hardy Cardassians, it was easy to colonize and became home to a large-scale dilithium mining operation, whilst the more temperate Chintoka 3 was an ideal agricultural colony. Between 2320 and 2370, the system went through a major economic boom thanks to the bounties reaped during the Bajoran occupation. As a result, many of the smaller planetoids were also developed, including Chalak, which lay between Chintoka 2 and 3, which served as a fortified defense battery, Chivor, which was used as an antimatter refinery, and on the edge of the system, AR-558, which housed the system's subspace relay, which allowed it communication across the breadth of the Union. Being the primary port of trade with the Beta Quadrant powers, Chintoka was already well defended before the outbreak of war in 2374. While it had been overrun during the Klingon invasion of 2372, the Cardassians, with the help of their Dominion allies, had significantly improved their defences since then. While the most obvious improvements were the automated defence turrets in orbit over Chintoka 2 and 3, these only made up a small part of the system's defences. The system was protected by an early warning detection grid and internal tracking satellites, which allowed the user to track the position of any and all starships within the system. The major centres of military power on Chintoka 2 and 3 were protected with localised shields and had a limited anti-orbital capability, while the outer planetoids used dampening fields for their protection. This, in concert with any friendly starships in the system, allowed the defender to slow down and blunt all but the largest of assaults. Due to its economic and strategic position, it was a key objective for the Allies to take in any invasion of the Cardassian Union. Securing Chintoka would allow the Allies to threaten the industrial core of the Union, with the shipyards of Monak, Kelvus and Toros only one sector over, whilst also threatening to cut off the agricultural colonies, as well as only being a single sector away from Cardassia Prime. While at the time the Allied powers could agree on little, they all agreed that Chintoka would make a valuable prize. and so they prepared to invade Cardassia in January of 2375, with Chintoka as their first target. On the 16th of January 2375, the Federation 12th Fleet under Admiral Ross, the Klingon Expeditionary Force under General Martok, and the Romulan White Fleet under Admiral Leitant entered the system. Totaling some 265 ships, they were confronted with a mere 5 squadrons of Jem'Hadar fighters, 15 ships against 260. Knowing that they stood no chance against such a large fleet, the Jem'Hadar instead opted for kamikaze attacks against the Klingons, since it would be them spearheading the planetary landings. The Jem'Hadar managed to take out 4 Vochas and 6 Katingas, vessels that would have been invaluable assets against the orbital platforms. Yet still confident that the Cardassian weapon platforms were not yet fully operational, the fleets pushed towards Chintoka 2 and 3 into range of the weapon platforms, carving a path towards the 2 planets. Yet, as the trailing vessels passed into the perimeter, the orbital platforms came online. Armed with spiral wave lances and siege caliber torpedoes, the platforms, making use of coordinated fire, laid waste to any ship unfortunate enough to attract their attention, deliberately targeting larger enemy vessels and vessels carrying siege weaponry. The platforms were extremely resilient to all but the most concentrated of return fire, their shields all drawing from a single large reactor on the moon of Chalak, transmitted to the platforms via subspace carrier wave. While such a system meant that the platforms had to be in relatively close proximity to the generator, it also made them far more durable than their older counterparts. The fleet was only able to escape total destruction by deceiving the system's tracking array into identifying the moon as a hostile target, leading the turrets to destroy their own power source. Despite the quick thinking of the Defiant's crew, the fleet still suffered critical losses. The flagship USS Galaxy lost power and had to be abandoned. The Klingon fleet had lost the majority of its larger cruisers, and the Romulan fleet was down to half strength. Fortunately, most of the ships lost had only been disabled, their crews surviving on emergency power before being rescued, and most of the hulls would in time be salvageable.
At first, it seemed like we got off easy. Most of the crews had actually survived, and we managed to pick them up after the battle. We'd need every single one of them. The ships themselves, while disabled, were easily salvageable, and gave us a supply of spare parts. Those came in very handy. And some of the ships could be repaired and relaunched. It seemed like such a mercy.
The Dominion responds quickly to the invasion of Chintoka, deploying the Cardassian 25th Order to Amleth Prime and Jem'Hadar Fleet Groups Alpha 7 and Gamma 12 to Septimus and Monak, whilst the 16th Order maintained a flanking position in the Kelvus system, ready to repulse any Allied advances. However, it would be some time before the Allies could entertain such a prospect. Not only were their ships damaged and depleted from the initial assault, more critically, the Allies had yet to secure the planets and the other critical infrastructure in the system, and so gave up any potential opportunity for a breakthrough, stalling the offensive. While the Allies had expected determined resistance on the lush Chintoka 3, they had presumed that the barren surface of Chintoka 2 would leave the Cardassian defenders no place to hide once they had established orbital superiority. However, the Cardassian garrison proved highly resourceful, using large dampening fields to block transporters and scanners, striking from within the deep desert at the Allied columns as they moved along the straight long roads that connected scattered settlements, employing low-flying aircraft and attack shuttles to launch rapid ambushes before fading into the desert. While the Klingons particularly attempted pursuit, they would always fall victim to Cardassian ambushes. And the Allies lacked the numbers needed to effectively counter the Cardassian armies, which were able to consistently outmaneuver the Allies every time. The 60,000 troops, who had been merely expecting to mop up found themselves playing a protracted game of cat and mouse across the deserts of Chintoka 2. While on Chintoka 3, the situation was equally poor. The Allies faced a Cardassian garrison of 300,000, as well as numerous Cardassian militia groups who had blended into the civilian population. For the first month, the Allies remained pinned down and isolated in the city of Galanthar, unable to break out. Only when on the 20th of February, a fresh wave of 120,000 Allied troops were they able to break out, conducting a second landing at the neighbouring settlements of Cre'tak and Golan before moving to encircle the Cardassian forces, allowing the First Army to break out of Galanthar and fight in the open. Yet as March turned to April, the Allies lost momentum and the Cardassians were able to solidify their positions, retaining roughly 60% of territory on the southern continent. Even in space, the situation was no better. Recovering and salvaging the many wrecked and disabled ships was a significant undertaking, made all the more difficult by the fact that most of the disabled vessels were on the larger side, and so required similarly sized vessels to extract them. While for the Federation, this was made relatively simple by the employment of the new Parliament-class battlecruisers, which had both the size and power to extract large ships like the Galaxy-class from the debris field, but also had the firepower to deter the harassing attacks carried out by the Dominion. From March onwards, the Dominion forces under the command of the infamous Legate Sobrag began conducting raids into the Chintoka system to further slow the Allies' progress. While Starfleet was reasonably experienced in recovering disabled ships, both the Romulans and Klingons were unaccustomed to this practice. Attempted recovery of warbirds in particular was a golden opportunity for Dominion raiding parties, as the only vessels large enough to recover warbirds was another warbird, requiring this large, slow starship to leave itself exposed for a protracted period. Well over the next 6 months, the Romulans and Klingons would succeed in recovering and repairing 80% of all lost ships. It would come at a cost that was mostly paid by their smaller attack ships, who were called on to deter raiders during recovery operations, and consequently suffered heavy attrition. While for the Klingons it was easy to make up for these losses, but for the Romulans it was considerably harder, as their attack ships were reliant on larger warbird motherships to transport them over long distances, warbirds which were far slower and more costly to build. As a result, while the White Fleet was able to reconstitute its warbird force with older Vamalak-class warbirds, it remained critically short of smaller escorts to protect these heavy assets, which spent most of their time cloaked in orbit over Chintoka 2 and 3, providing orbital fire support whenever the opportunity arose. Further out in the system's outer planets, the Allied hold was far more tenuous. The antimatter refinery on the moons of the gas giant Chintoka 4 was luckily only guarded by Cardassians, who could be relied on not to destroy the facility to spite the Allies. Yet equally, the Allies could not directly fire on the facility either, forcing them to land troops on the lunar surface and conduct an EVA assault to gain access to the facility. Even once inside, weapons fire had to be kept to lower energy levels, and explosives such as grenades were prohibited. Naturally, the Klingons under General Martok took well to this kind of combat, and slowly but surely, level by level, corridor by corridor, they had successfully cleared the Cardassian defenders by May. Unfortunately, on the dwarf planetoid of AR-558, the Klingons' Federation allies endured a far more fraught experience. AR-558 is relatively isolated on the system's periphery, and so Starfleet was unable to maintain consistent orbital superiority. While Starfleet's ground forces were able to capture many communication relays scattered across the planetoid, holding them was an entirely separate issue. With inconsistent orbital cover, the Jem'Hadar enjoyed frequent reinforcements and occasional fire support. With the Allied fleet stretched thin across the Chintoka system, it was impossible to fully secure the orbit of AR-558. as a large enough Dominion raiding party could easily drive them off. Anywhere Allied defences left a gap or were too thin, Legate Sir Bragg made sure to seize the opportunity, maintaining constant pressure on the invaders and sapping any momentum. Faced with an extremely precarious strategic situation, Admiral Ross took the decision to focus resources on securing the inner planets of the Chintoka system, even if that meant under-resourcing the operations in the debris field and the periphery. While not popular among the troops stationed on the peripheral fronts, or the starship crews who patrolled them, from June to July the Allies saw increased progress as the Cardassian garrisons began to run low on supplies and ammunition, and Ross's belt of iron prevented any Dominion ships from resupplying their troops on Chintoka 2 and 3. And through July and August, more and more Cardassian units surrendered, although they remained significant holdouts on both planets. But by September of 2375, the Allies had secured their hold on the Chintoka system. During these long, tedious months of ground campaigns, General Martok grew ever more restless, launching ever bolder and riskier counter-raids in neighbouring systems, including 2 attempts to destroy the Monak shipyards, his first raid ending in disaster, losing him 30% of his force. But with the help of Starfleet engineers, Martok was able to carry out a second strike and successfully disabled or damaged much of the Monak shipyards. While these raids were viewed with romanticism by many, and made for good news in an area of the war where there was little, it did have consequences for his comrades. As the Chintoka campaign dragged on, convoys began to form entering the system, carrying fresh troops and supplies and returning laden with casualties. This long column of ships provided ample opportunity for Sir Bragg's raiders to further strain not only the Allies' strategic position, but their political positions also. The large number of casualties produced from the fighting on the planets placed a considerable burden on Allied logistics. While a few hospital ships were deployed, they posed a significant liability, while the Klingons shared Starfleet bases and would rotate the injured back to these bases for recovery and retraining. The Romulans did not possess this luxury, with the fact that many wounded soldiers died during the transit to Romulus becoming a political scandal. Romulan domestic support for the war remained tenuous, and these unnecessary tragedies only further served the Dominion's purposes.
Of course we singled out the Romulans. They were only half committed to the war effort anyway. They didn't have the stomach for our modern warfare. All it would take was a swift blow to the chin, and they'd turn tail and run. Compared to their Federation and Klingon allies, they were almost target practice. At least, at first.
Fortunately, Senator Cre'tak was able to secure permission from the Bajoran government to build a hospital on the Bajoran moon of Derna. However, this arrangement soon soured, as the Bajorans discovered that the Romulans had placed plasma torpedoes on the moon. The Romulans, for their part, had become extremely paranoid of Dominion raids, believing that they may strike at Bajor and thus Derna. Yet, when confronted by the Bajoran militia, the Romulans stood down. While the alliance held, the Chintoka campaign was straining it to its limit. Disproportionate Romulan casualties, Klingon rashness, and rigid Federation rules of engagement made what was hoped to have been a swift and decisive Allied breakthrough into a meat grinder. Over 8 months, Starfleet suffered 6,072 killed and over 25,000 wounded. The Klingons lost 4,250 killed with over 15,000 wounded, and the Romulans suffered 5,621 killed and 20,000 wounded, whilst the Cardassians saw 9,536 killed and over 50,000 wounded, and the Dominion themselves lost over 20,000 Jem'Hadar in the 8-month battle for the system. Finally, on the 9th of September, the Allies had secured all key positions in the Chintoka system. General Martok wasted no time and advanced to Septimus III, while Starfleet regrouped in preparation for the next phase of the invasion. However, the Romulan fleet had suffered severe attrition over the past 8 months, with only 6 operational warbirds and 36 escorts, and so Admiral Ross agreed that their objectives would be reassigned to the Federation 19th Fleet. This, however, did not relieve tensions within the Alliance, and accusations began to be made by both officers and political leaders that the Romulans were not pulling their weight and were in fact using the war to further their own interests. And Romulan conduct hitherto did nothing to dissuade these notions. Fortunately for the Allies, these petty disputes were all forgotten when on the 25th of September 2375, the Breen Confederacy joined the war, marking their entry with an audacious attack on Earth, sacrificing an entire fleet just to strike a blow at the heart of Starfleet. The Romulans and Klingons both took note.
We had always entertained the possibility of striking Earth, entertained being the operative term. Even disregarding the wider implications of such an attack, Earth had seen over 200 years of fortifications since that Great War. No rational commander would ever countenance such a reckless expenditure of force. Anyone willing to do so should be respected and feared.
When I learned what the Breen had done, I knew we had a fight on our hands, but I couldn't even imagine what a fight it would be.
Soon after, on the 1st of October, the Breen Sapphire Fleet under the command of Thot Gore led a counterattack against the Allies in the Chintoka system. Supported by the Cardassian 16th and 25th Orders and Jem'Hadar Fleet Group Alpha 7, with over 350 enemy ships bearing down on their beachhead, Admiral Ross and General Martok were forced to withdraw the majority of their forces from Septimus III to reinforce Chintoka. Additional forces were also dispatched from Deep Space Nine, including Sisko's 12th Attack Wing. Rather than engage the Breen immediately, Admiral Ross held back his ships and awaited the arrival of reinforcements, even though this left the garrisons on AR-558 and Chafar exposed to orbital assault. By 0727, the Allied fleet had fully formed in the vicinity of Chintoka 3 and deployed into a diamond formation, with Starfleet holding down the flanks, the Romulans in the centre with their heavy warbirds, and Martok's Klingon Expeditionary Force in reserve. The Dominion forces deployed in an echelon of attack, led by the Breen. As they closed into weapons range with the Allied fleet, the Breen fleet manoeuvred starboard, engaging the 12th Fleet and Sisko's Attack Wing. Being the first major engagement against the Breen, Admiral Ross wanted to make an impression and authorised full release of quantum torpedoes. As the Breen fleet came into range, Sisko and his comrades fired a volley of quantum torpedoes, successfully destroying 15 Breen vessels in just a few seconds.
That was a shot worthy of a Klingon. I'd never seen such a devastating shot in my life. At least that's what I thought, until the Breen returned fire.
Despite the initial shock of quantum torpedo fire, the Breen drove home their attack, deploying their secret weapon, an energy dampener. By firing a pulse of highly charged phase positrons contained within a subspace field, these weapons could render any starship completely inert by triggering a polarity inversion cascade, turning all electrons in the power grid into positrons, fusing the system and shutting down the entire power grid. Sisko and the 12th Fleet were hit first, then the Romulans, who had been fixed by the Cardassians, then cutting between Martok and Ross's fleet, knocking out their ships too, leaving them drifting and defenseless against the successive waves of Cardassian and Dominion ships. After disabling all of Ross's ships, the fleet swung round and began firing on the Klingons, only to break off the attack. While originally this was thought to be a direct order from the Founder, recent evidence suggests that the Breen had been intent on wiping out the Klingons, but broke off when one of the ships they fired upon was unaffected. With the enemy fleet broken and not wishing to overplay his hand, Thot Gore ordered his ships to break off. leaving the Cardassians and Jem'Hadar to harass the Klingons as they collected as many escape pods as they could, every one of them carrying broken, beaten, and terrified soldiers. As Martok retreated, he inadvertently brought with him another Dominion weapon: fear. Fear and despair. While most of the crews would go back into action with newer and better ships, many were completely broken and would never fight again. And like those who had previously fought at Wolf 359 almost 9 years before, they would carry these scars for the rest of their lives.
Retreating is one thing. I had my fair share of those over the years. But to spend so long fighting, to sacrifice so much of who you were, to lose your friends one by one, and then watch as all that sacrifice is undone in mere minutes. That breaks you, down to your core, so you can even comprehend what's happening anymore. We just sat there, in that escape pod, staring right through each other, and waiting, until they came to finish the job. It didn't matter to us. We were already dead.